Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. Really, we've kind of lured you here under false pretenses. There's really not a talk today. We're just doing a psychological experiment to see what kind of people would come into a dark auditorium on a beautiful Montana September morning. And clearly, it's people who are interested in murder, notorious and unsolved. So thanks for being here. I know this is going to be a great presentation. If you're a regular at some of our past programs, you've seen Brian before because he's spoken a couple of times and he always delivers. Brian D'Ambrosio was born in New York. He grew up in Yonkers and came to Montana in 2000 working as a journalist. In 2012, he published his first book after 2.5 years of research, and that book was Menacing Face Worth Millions, A Life of Charles Bronson. He's followed those up by a number of books. I'm not even sure, how many books have you published? Okay. Okay, or one more than what we said last time we were here, so at least one more. Anyway, those books include Warrior in the Ring, The Life of World Champion Native American Boxer Marvin Campbell. I guess you saw that, he got his belt back? Yes, sir. Yeah, Marvin Campbell, that's a different story, but he had his belt stolen 30 years ago? Uh, yeah, there's like a presentation, very fancy belt that had a lot of meaning to him. Anyway, that was really cool. He wrote Montana and the NFL, Shot in Montana, A History of Big Sky Cinema, Montana Entertainers, Famous and Almost Forgotten, and most recently, Montana Murders, Notorious and Unsolved. And that is what we're here to hear about today. So thank you for being here. And thank you, Brian.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me. So the one thing that I was asked to do, I forgot, was to put the speakerphone on. So it's kind of interesting having the headset. I always feel like like a motivational speaker or something, or like Tony Robbins or something. It's kind of a little different for me. So well, thanks for coming, and yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me again, Kirby, and thank you for such a positive and uplifting and inspirational segue. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. So I guess I was going to start with the question that somebody just asked me a few minutes ago was the why. So my background is I've always written about exclusively nonfiction, music, art, entertainment, travel, a little bit of history. I've always been interested in kind of quirky kind of characters who might be on the fringes of things, on the margins of things. So, and I was down in Kansas working on a series of stories about like outsider artists or like folk artists. They have a whole bunch of different names, like grassroots artists, vernacular artists, people who make things and create art in environments that are outside of traditional art environments. So someone, who like breaks their leg and all of a sudden decides to build a concrete park in the backyard. So that really interests me. So I was there for a couple months, and I had looked as in this little town that I was living in, Lindsborg, Kansas, which is like this little oasis on the plains of Kansas. It's a little town of 300 people, full of woodworkers and artisans and sculptors. And there was some information that was being requested about a murder that took place in a little town called Assyria, Kansas, which was right up the road. And Assyria is a population maybe 200. It's a kind of a tight-knit rural farming community. And a woman there named Lori Heimer, she'd been murdered in her home during a harvest, and the husband purportedly was on the combine. There were no witnesses. And they were looking for information about some trucks and about people in the area, and they thought it could have been tied to her business of grooming dogs. But I just decided to contact the family and look into doing maybe more of a like a social autopsy, as they call it, of the victim, and do a series of stories about her and her life, but try to take it from more of a from not in the perspective as, hey, I was gonna be able to solve this, but in the perspective like, who was she as a person? So I get to know her and her family, and immediately it was such a gripping subject and such an arresting subject that I started to go back. So every once a year for about 2 months, and spend some more time with the family and look into leads and to write about it. So this went on for maybe 3 or 4 years. And in the process, I decided that it might be really interesting to take that murder and maybe do something visually, as I've always had an interest in film. So I ended up enlisting the services of a buddy and also hiring a film crew. So we went down to shoot it as a documentary. And in the process of working on all these interviews, I realized that the people that I'd been close to, I believe were involved. I believe it was a family-related matter, and it was an inside job, and everybody knew except for me. So I went to the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, gave them a 6-hour deposition, gave them all the interviews, and left Kansas, and I haven't been back since. So this is true, yeah. And then so I got back. This is a couple of years ago. It might have been sometime in let me think, maybe March. And I ran into a friend of mine who runs a paper called the Montana Press Monthly, and her name is Riley, and she had been telling me about this suspicious, a series of suspicious or unexplained deaths in Livingston that have plagued the little town of Livingston from the mid-90s all the way up until about 2003. And there was one murder in particular that no one had touched and talked about. It was a kid named Nelson Mcnair who was found in the Yellowstone River in 1995. He was just a teenager. For years, the coroner had been adamant and steadfast that he couldn't. It was unexplained. It was unknowable and unfathomable, and he couldn't figure out what happened to this poor kid. So Riley says, well, why don't you want to tackle this? I'll give you the space. I'll give you the breadth and depth and scope and time that you need to do it. So I started working on Nelson's story, and I've been working on that for about 3 years. It did make the book. And so in the process of going through that whole, the story, I did talk to the coroner in Livingston, Mr. Jenkins. Well, I found the man who found the body, who confirmed the fact that Nelson's head had been blown away and that he'd been shot in the back of the head. So I'd take all this information over the course of a couple of years and presented it to the Department of Criminal Investigation in Helen, and they've reopened the case. Actually, they've opened the case for the first time, so they're conducting a comprehensive investigation to what happened to Nelson. That's one of the cases in the book. So the why is, I was initially interested in a case in Kansas. I came back to Montana, and I was led to the Nelson Mcnair case for a reason. I've been led to other cases, similar cases. So that would be the why. But the other why, I guess, is because it's uniquely gripping and uniquely fascinating. And I was going to read a little bit about the why. So I'm going to mix it up a little bit. I'm going to talk, but I'm also going to read, if that's okay. So this is a good answer to the why. For thousands of years, humans have been gripped by tales of killers in our midst. As long as we have mated, congregated, or foraged the peripheries of the earth, we have also, alas, murdered one another and written about it. Fascination with brutality is nothing new. Truman Capote's groundbreaking, controversial true crime masterpiece, In Cold Blood, first published in 1966, is but part of a perverse reflection that has frightened and warned us for ages. Indeed, true crime publishing started with the Gutenberg Press and continues to this day. My dad was a police officer too. He was a detective, so that also factors into it too a little bit. So, and as far as Montana, the book is has 21st century cases. There's some older ones, all the way. The most recent one is about 10 years ago, and there's certainly enough room to do more. So I was working on several other ones, but these were just ones that either I happened to stumble upon or were suggested to me, and it's random. I didn't do it to exclude any. These were the ones that kind of came up that I was just most interested in at the time. So there's the Notorious angle, and there's the Unsolved, and there's both. So as far as murder in Montana in the 20th century, this is what I had been thinking. 20th century murder and mayhem in Montana have left as much as an indelible impression on the collective conscience of the nation as the state's fly fishing and skiing, perhaps even more so. More people on both coasts are probably familiar with the Unabomber than the Big Sky Resort or the Blackfoot River if a river runs through it. The average Montanan might not recognize the name of every Montana town, but they've certainly heard of the name Kaczynski, the brilliant child prodigy who went on to bomb universities and airlines while living as a hermit in an itsy-bitsy cabin near Lincoln. Perhaps no two men set back, or alas, negatively advance Montana's image more than Dan and Don Nichols. You remember the yeah. You know, he got out, well, you know, he was released, the father, but, you know, recently. The father and son mountain men had lived by poaching game and growing small gardens at various hidden camps in the mountains near Big Sky. In the summer of 1984, the deranged duo abducted world-class biathlete Carrie Swenson with the stated intention of finding a wife for the son. The crimes, the kidnapping quickly escalated into the murder of one of Swenson's would-be rescuers, and prolonged manhunt in the wilderness northwest of Yellowstone National Park finally ended when a sheriff stormed into a winter camp used by Nichols and his son. Some of the acts in this book, such as the specifics and timeline of serial killer David Meerhofer, who's pictured here and in the center. David Meerhofer are beyond chilling. In 1974, the detestable Meierhofer was arrested and charged with the kidnappings and slayings of Sandra Dykeman Smulligan, 19, and Susie Yeager, 7, who was taken from her family's tent while they camped near Three Forks in 1973. Before he purportedly hung himself in a jail cell, Meierhofer admitted to randomly slaying other victims, some even younger. May we never again see the likes of someone such as Meierhofer. So I think that one of the most difficult things of this project is dealing with such substantive and strong content. So I think one of the things too is when you write about something like this, there's in many cases, especially with the unsolved cases, there's no end. So if I write about music and there's a deadline and a show and an event, it's concrete, and it's finite. But when you work on something that's unsolved, it's infinite, and there are connections that you have with family members, and people who knew the victim, they hopefully they stay forever, and hopefully you have that there's a bond and a trust that is just unshakable. So, well, I'm going to move into. I've got some. I have hold on a second. A little folder here with some pictures I wanted just to scan through and kind of talk about some of the content and some of the things that are in the book. It says right there, society. So see, there's the special little folder for you. So. Well, if anyone knows this person, they can just shout it right on out. I mean, does anybody know who this is? It's one of the only photos of this gentleman that is known to exist. So no book would be complete about the history of Montana murders, especially historical murders, without the lynching of labor leader Frank Little. So, the vigilantes, abducted firebrand labor leader Frank Little from his Butte hotel room in the middle of the night, and the next morning his body was hanging from a railroad trestle. No one was ever held accountable. And this is just a fantastic photo of Frank that comes from his great-granddaughter, who's been here before too, and that would be a book that I would highly recommend. You might even have a copy out here, right, of Janie Bodkin's book. Yeah, I would highly recommend picking that up. One thing I did find was, I don't think I have a picture of it. I did find an original photograph of the people at Frank Little's procession, like in Butte in 1917. So there's Frank. So there's I don't think any discussion of murders in Montana would be complete without a discussion of Frank, or at least an image, a little bit about Frank. we don't know. Yeah, I guess that's always been, that's always been, that's always been a matter of, of great, conjecture or speculation. So, his advocacy is still embraced by workers around the world, but as far as anyone ever being charged, that's a matter of, speculation and conjecture. So this is a really, really brutal case that I found in the archives, in the Butte archives, actually. This is like this really fiendish murder of a wealthy widow. And, the newspapers back then, they spared no detail just about how brutal this was. I mean, these were some of the things articles that were used that were in the newspaper. I mean, there were ropes and belts and chains. I'll read you a little bit about this case. So I tried to find some cases that were heavily publicized. There was a lot of information, like Frank Little. I mentioned the Unabomber just a tiny bit, but there's such a great catalog as far as the Unabomber's life and his activities that I didn't want to spend too much time on it. So I also tried to have a balance of the ones that were very well publicized and the ones that were a little more obscure. And the Butte Archives has this fantastic record of killings. They have folders after folders. And in fact, I even mentioned the Butte Archives keeps folders on the most heinous and infamous murder cases in Silverbill County. The earliest documents recorded murders committed between 1894 and 1899. So the first registered slaying took place on January 15th, 1894, with the notation, Ying Wei Fu shoots and kills Gu Yik Mu. The following day, the body of one Felix Doncel was found in the brickyard, and 2 months later, Addie Collins killed her newborn infant son by throwing him into the bottom of an outhouse. On the final day of March 1894, Chin Yi Tuk killed Kwong Tuk Wing with a knife and a hatchet. So they have all of the names in this big register, and it says, name, victim, and method. So I found this one, and this one was solved, but this is a rich widow of Butte, so she was the victim of one of the most beautiful. Sorry. Sometimes I talk about boxing, and I'll say things that, it's beautiful brutality. So I think, so sorry about that. One of the most brutal murders known to Montana police. So Christina Wilson's body was found in the second-story room of the Paragon Hotel, 107 West Broadway, on March 11, 1930. Her arms and legs had been lashed to the four corners of a bed with ropes tied in hangman's knots, her head battered, and a hand towel apparently tamped down her throat with an iron pipe. The hangman's knots, according to the Montana Post, are pointed to by officers as evidence showing the brutal crime was premeditated. The woman's body was completely covered by a quilt. Her false teeth were found in a pool of blood on the floor, a pillow placed over her face. The bed and floor of the room were inundated in blood, apparently from the wound to the head. An examination of her apartment showed that it had been thoroughly ransacked. Drawers were pulled out, clothing thrown about, and a security box containing personal papers broken open. An attempt had been made to pry open the window, and the glass was cracked. Wilson was a wealthy widow. She owned the entire Paragon block. According to media accounts, quote, Miss Wilson was last seen at about 5:45 p.m. in her own room by two girls, and she was missed at 7 p.m. So they implicated one man, and he fled Montana, and he was picked up in Texas, and he admitted that he killed her because he, quote unquote, he needed money for food. So he escaped, he was apprehended, and then all these sinister details started to emerge at the trial. I mean, you thought that little part was kind of graphic. They went into graphic, excruciating detail. So they had the trial. So he was sentenced and he was led away, and then he got a life sentence. So, and this crime happened in 1930, and you know how long his life sentence lasted? Take a guess. Throw some numbers at me. If you get a little more than 5. So his lifetime sentence, he didn't remain behind closed walls for too many years. So he was paroled in 1942. Imagine that, after serving 12 and a half years. Yeah. So he had a good prison record and time knocked off for good behavior. Can you imagine that? So the governor, this is the governor at the time, Sam Ford, writes a letter to the State Board of Pardons stating that he was, quote, not armed, nor did he have the intention of committing murder. So in a very somewhat perverse justification. So Ford claims that Payette, quote, only intended to rob the victim and didn't realize the consequences which might result from it, since he had placed a gag upon his victim's face for the purpose of enabling him to escape the scene of a robbery. Well, what a defense, right? You know, what a defense. That is terrible. Boy, did I hit the, I must have hit the wrong, oh, there we go. Whoa, hold on a second. We're getting too far ahead. Well, that's a nice picture, huh? Anybody know this face? Does it look like the face of a killer? Of a murderess? Oh. Yes? No? Maybe so? So, she wouldn't be in the book if she wasn't, right? So, 15-year-old murderess. So this is perhaps Montana's youngest convicted. Does they say femme fatale? Is that how you say? Or, you know, femme? Is that French? Femme fatale? So Muriel Murphy, you know, she was only 15 years old when she was sent to prison for her part in a Great Falls murder. She was found guilty of luring an older man to his beating death. So interesting enough, she was charged with first-degree murder for the killing of a man named Gus Anderson, who was probably in his 50s. Her and her boyfriend were 18, so they were charged in 1937. So I get into some of the interesting details about the case. It was kind of like the trial. I mean, the trial of a century. I know that's kind of overblown and maybe cliche or hackneyed at this point, but it kind of was at that time. It received it was a sensational amount of press for obvious reasons. So Muriel claimed that there was, you know, it was a proposition, and then she reneged, and then the boyfriend beat this man to death. But it looks like it was more likely than not premeditated. But she had claimed that it might have been an act of protection. So they get into this at the trial. She claimed that there were improper advances by this man, and her boyfriend and her killed him. So, but she was convicted, you know, in Cascade County in 1937 for the death of Anderson. The jury found that they were accountable of luring him outside. They were in a bar where the man struck him, and the inflicted injuries proved fatal. So, interesting enough, the governor at the time in 1940 received many petitions, like asking these two to receive clemency and to release them because of their age. And then they ended up being released. They were released in about 8 years, and then in 1949 they were on trial in Alaska again for felony charges and assault with a deadly weapon. So anyhow, that's kind of another interesting one too. She's in there. It's a great shot. So this one fascinates me. I don't know if anyone knows who this is, and if they do, yeah, I'll give you a free copy of the book. Yeah. Anybody? Let's hear it. Throw some names out. So do you think is he the victim, or do you think he's the perpetrator? Ooh, wow. So this is Jimmy McGinn, or I should say. He was a pastor. He was killed by the Korean Army. I just included this one because I thought this was so interesting. You know, there's a couple of stories in there that, you know, the murderers weren't in Montana. And Father McGinn, he was from Butte, and he was one of the first people killed by the Red Army during the Korean War who wasn't Korean. He was born in Butte in 1911, and then he immigrated to Ireland and ended up going to South Korea. Returned to Butte in the 1940s and always had a lifelong commitment and connection to Butte. And he was in Korea because he felt that that's where his services were needed. But when the Korean War broke out on June 25th, 1950, he was a pastor at a parish, and about a month later, the communists invaded the village, and Father Jim was one of about 35 missionaries who were in Korea at the time. They were arrested, and he was executed probably about July 5th, 1950. There is a small memorial and a headstone, even to this day, but he might be one of the first non-Koreans to be killed in the Korean War, and he was, had a lifelong connection to Butte, and so I thought that would be interesting to include him as well. So, elderly couple. Wow, it gets darker, doesn't it, guys? I mean, this one's really interesting too. This is from 1963. Anybody remember this in particular when it flashes up on the screen? This is a double murder of a couple who lived up at a camp. They ran a little resort up by McGregor Lake. You know, what direction's McGregor Lake from Kalispell? Quick. Oh, how many miles? 33, yeah, 33 miles west. Yeah, that's where it is. So there weren't many details that came out of this old newspaper clipping, other than that they had both. They were both elderly. They both ran a resort. Then they'd been slain, and unfortunately, all the leads just sort of turned sour. And then listen to this, and this happens too. So for decades, this case goes unsolved. I mean, red hot leads, and tips, they turn cold, the trail dries up, but the information as to what happened exists. Well, about 4 decades later, a woman calls the police department, and she says, my ex-husband, I just found out that he's dead. He murdered these two people in Montana 40 years ago. I never called and I never reported it, only because I was scared to death of this man. But as soon as she found out that he was dead, she called the police. So the police asked for details, and it turns out her name's Arlena. She had this secret. She believed she knew the man who murdered the Eastons. So she traced it to this man over here, a convicted bank robber named Kenneth Pendleton. This is a guy, he spent most of his life in bars, behind bars, and maybe in bars too, and on the lam. So he was from Washington, and this guy, he was a prison escapee, a convicted bank robber. He would rob a bank, and then he'd get out, and he'd go rob another bank, And he actually escaped from an island, from one time, a prison island, an island that was on a prison that was on an island. So he married this woman, Arlena, in 1959. They met at Spokane, and they ended up in Montana. And then on one bitterly cold evening in 1963, he came back to the cabin, covered in blood. So he had told his wife that he had hit a deer at the time, and he didn't want to talk about the incident, and she never brought it up again. So interesting is that after the slayings at McGregor Lake, it was about a year after, so he and his wife, the two of them had left Montana. They went to Spokane to live with her parents, but apparently he had threatened her, that he would do harm to her or do harm to the children. They got divorced, and she never saw him again. And then he was living a life of continual crime, and then it was 2001, Kenneth Pendleton, he was found dead. So he had been found beaten to death in Canada on January 11, 2001. So although no physical evidence ever linked him to the murders, records that confirm that he and his wife were in the area about the time of the murders. So police are fairly confident that he was involved and that he acted alone, but they were able to clear it in 2001, a murder that took place in 1963, because his wife, at the time came forward. That's crazy, isn't it? So, this is Dave Meyerhofer. So this is Montana's homegrown terror. And I mentioned, I had some transcripts of some things that Meyerhofer said, some of his interviews that I had put in here. So the 4 slayings occurred over 7 years, and none of the victims was older than 19. The murder method fluctuated, and there was no evidence that a lone, demented mind was behind the murders. But in the small town of Manhattan, panic and speculation reigned. So that was from 1967 to about 1974. Does anybody who lived in Manhattan around that time remember Meyerhofer? So, oh, there was one other one. Hold on, I'm going to go back. I was trying to keep it chronological, but I've got one other one. If I could. Oh, here, yeah. I was trying to keep this chronological, but I might have actually skipped this one. This is from 1924, and it's in Butte. This was an interesting case, and it was these axe murders that took place in Billings. And as the headline says, couple murdered with axe. So I'm going to read you a little bit about this case. This is from 1924. So, bloody fingerprints on a water faucet and washboards supplied the only clues to the murderer who killed Mr. and Mrs. Nels Anderson by splitting their heads with an axe. The couple was killed in their combination barbershop and beauty parlor, and Billings police were hopeful that the fingerprints on the wash bowl, a few feet from where Mr. Anderson was slain and where the murderer washed his bloody hands, would serve, quote, to aid in the apprehension of the murderer. The murderer seemed a curious mixture of mad, for obvious reasons, and methodical. The axe handle apparently had been wiped clean of blood. It's interesting that they wiped clean of blood in the 20s, are thinking about fingerprints. It surprises me. So the Billings Gazette summarized the police department's belief that the heinous crime was solvable. So this comes right from the Billings police, or from the newspaper article. Police are clinging to the theory that the murders were committed by an insane man with a desire to avenge some real or fancied wrong, and are hopeful that the fingerprints may prove a valuable aid in their search. Oh, back to the fingerprints again. So here, and then there's this headline in a paper called the Decatur Herald, which might be overstating the obvious, but the dual murder is believed to be the work of a maniac. So that was the headline. And there were press reports that the police had put out that they were looking for, quote unquote, a maniac, yeah. And are looking for, anything that led them to a suspicious character or a maniac. Anyway, this crime was never solved, but it's just another one that is in there. So, I tried to put these pictures chronologically. Hold on one second. Oh, no, hold on a second. I'm jumping ahead. You guys know that face too, right? No. Okay. Okay, so, all right. This one's been in, this case has been in the news a lot. This is from 1956. You've probably know about this one. Have you seen this one in there? This is from, so when I wrote this book, when I wrote this, it wasn't solved. It's from 1956. And about, 6 months ago, police revealed that this teen couple that were executed on Lover's Lane, that it was solved through modern DNA technology. This is the oldest case in history to be the oldest case to be solved using modern technology and modern methods. So this couple, Patricia, she's 16 and she's from Great Falls, and this is a young airman named Lloyd Bogle. He's 18. He's from Waco. So they were executed one night in January of 1956. The killer or killers apparently forced the young girl to witness the execution of her boyfriend before they shot her. At the time I wrote this, the double murder remains unsolved. So this was written from an unsolved perspective, and like I said, just about 6 months ago, this was a case that that was solved through modern DNA technology and using genealogical sites and using modern tools and using advanced DNA replication. They were able to trace this to a man who's since deceased, but they're 100%. Yeah, go ahead. So the man's name, and I forget his name now, it was not someone that they had ever suspected or they ever believed capable. They know that he lived in the community. I believe his last name was Gould. He's since deceased, but he didn't live in Montana for the rest of his life. But police had always suspected, even up until like 2014, that it might have been the work of a serial killer. They were trying to tie it to the activities and whereabouts and trajectory of other serial killers, and they really thought that was most likely that this couple or these two young people were executed by a serial killer. And there were a lot of compelling hypotheses, but the case remained uncleared up until about 6 months ago. And in all the information I've read, and this was a great, this made national news, and there wasn't much information about the person that they linked to the case. It wasn't as if it was an ex-boyfriend or a family member, or this guy had a long-standing connection to the state. There was one website that did find a photo of him around that time in the 1950s, and he was in his early 20s, but the details about him are shady. So, but this one was solved, and it was cleared, and it was at the time I wrote it, it was still open. And about 6 or 8 months ago, it was announced, Cascade County announced that they had the person, and they were fairly confident that they could clear this case.
Did they link the killer to any other murders?
It's a good question. I don't know if they linked the killer to any other murders. I don't know that. But it's a good question. Yeah, that's a great question.
When these people were executed, what was our method of execution? Still hanging?
Yeah, they were shot. Yeah, they were shot. Yeah, they were shot in a little area known as Lover's Lane. So that was a January. I'll bring their picture back. So that would have been January the 2nd of 1956. So they had gone out to the drive-in for hamburgers, and they parked at Wadsworth Park. I think that's. Do you guys know where that is in Great Falls? So, yeah, and and his body was discovered by a bunch of boys, and then he had been stationed, I guess, at Maelstrom Air Force Base. So that's what brought him to that area. And she was found on an embankment about 7 miles from that Wadsworth Park just a few days later. And again, if you read some of the contemporary accounts, they really thought that there was a madman on the loose. And those were the headlines. Mad killer on the loose, madman on the loose. And but it's a good question. Does someone, who engages in this type of heinous act and who's involved in such cruelty, it's hard to imagine that this person just quits, or stops, but there are cases, and one of them is in the book, where the killer was outed in a very similar circumstance for a double murder, and he was dead too. Well, I'm going to get into that one just next. It's a good segue. But he was named as the killer, and turns out he lived in the community of Billings for the rest of his life, and he probably wasn't involved in any other crimes and had a family, and worked, and seemed to be a fairly upstanding member of the community. So, what could have happened to the man? Yeah, what did he do, and where did he stay, and what is life like? What was his life like? That's a good question, and I'm sure that authorities are combing, his whereabouts, and are probably scouring any information they can to see if they could trace him to any other crimes. So, but this one, thankfully was solved, and it's unfortunate that the killers are identified. A killer or killers are identified posthumously. There's nothing more satisfying, right, than seeing somebody brought in with handcuffs, 40, 50 years later after the crime. I think that satisfies the spirit of the vendetta, Oh, okay, so I'm a big boxing fan, so I think we might have touched on this, and this is a story that I particularly enjoyed. Does anybody recognize this man right here? He's a little, I would say that I would identify him as obscure, probably as a fighter, but not in the late '60s in Montana. Yeah, he was very much identifiable. His name is Spider Mccallum, and he was also a popular tavern owner in Missoula after he quit boxing. But so at age 12, Spider, his name's James. So he won his first boxing trophy, and he was a welterweight, and he was reported to have more than 100 amateur and professional boxing matches, though he never contended for a major boxing title. And a lot of those fights that he had, they were in clubs and gyms and theaters and old buildings, and at the circus or the fair or wherever. So interesting enough, there were a lot of tales about Spider that preceded him. He was kind of a larger than life figure. So he was born in Dobson, Montana, of all places. So he was born there in November of 1912, and they were adopted out at an orphanage, and his family moved to Bozeman when he was 14, attended some local schools, and he moved to Missoula and joined the CCC camp and started boxing. Had a really interesting life, too. It looks like he had done a whole lot of different things while he was in Missoula. He had a number of jobs when he was boxing, including he was a security guard and worked at the Northern Pacific Railroad, was a sugar beet processor, and eventually was also a boxing promoter. But what he was known for more than boxing was this tavern in Missoula. So there's Spider right there. This is called the Maverick Bar. Has anybody been in the Maverick Bar? Remember the Maverick Bar in Missoula? So I guess old Spider over here was known to have this superhuman ability to leap over a bar and tackle someone with at amazing speed. I guess he was kind of like Superman. There were some stories about. It was a rough bar apparently too. I think Spider ended up getting stabbed and getting poked with knives a couple times and separating fights, but it was known as a very characterful and colorful bar. And it was 633 Woody Street. So that was where old Spider had his bar. So apparently it was known as the Helena Hotel, if anybody remembers that, which started operating maybe in the 1940s. So at this notoriously rough bar, there's a photo of Mr. Spider, and so it took a vicious and brutal blow with an axe to do what hundreds of fists could not, which is put James F. Mccallum down for the count. So it was a robbery slaying that ended the life of the popular ex-boxer and Missoula nightclub owner nicknamed Spider. This is another kind of interesting case too. So he was murdered in February of '69, and three men were charged. Two of them were released, and then a kid named David Tamietti, who was the son of the Mineral County Sheriff Francis Tamietti, who lived in Superior, who was raised in Superior and attended schools in Superior, and went to college in Missoula. He was eventually charged with Spider's murder, and at the first trial, Tamietti there was a mistrial, and then police identified that theft was the motive, and it was a little murky trying to figure out how they knew each other, how Spider knew Tamietti, but Tamietti's connection was kind of nebulous, though it might have been at the Maverick Bar. So I did a little research on Tamietti, and it looks like the perpetrator was at Montana State University. He was a pre-forestry student. And the interesting thing is that I found Spider's daughter. He has a daughter who's alive. Her name's Anita, and she had. I called her and I said, "Well, yeah, I was always been interested in your dad." I said, "Is there anything that you can tell me about him? Do you have records? I mean, are there pictures? Did he leave a journal? I mean, what?" She said, "I didn't really know him." She said, "I remember him living at that house where he was killed." And she says, "I remember David Tamietti too." So this is what she had told me about their connection and their possible connection. "I was 19 years old when my dad was killed," says Anita Spooner. "I just called him the day before to let him know I had had a baby girl, and he didn't answer." Spooner once lived at the Ryman Avenue house with her father, and she remembered visiting him a few months before he was killed and seeing Tamietti there. This is Anita. "Dave Tamietti was at my dad's house, and I didn't know who he was at the time," says Spooner. "Dad was big on bringing in people who were bad to help them. He had a big heart. I was sitting on the couch, and Dave Tamietti kept walking around the living room in circles. and he never said a word. Of course, I didn't stay very long. I didn't feel comfortable with him there. My dad seemed okay. He had David living with him. So theft was eventually established as a motive. So the first trial ended up in a mistrial. The second trial of Tammy Eddy, he was sentenced. That was in 1970. I think actually what ended up happening, he had plea bargained before the second trial. So he was released from prison actually in the mid-70s. You know, there's a theme here, right? I don't think you do a lot of time when you kill people, at least. So Tammy Eddy, he went back to Superior, and then he couldn't reintegrate to society or was unable to cope with reintegration of society. And he died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound on June 5th, 1981. But it wouldn't be the last violent death associated with the legacy of Spider Mccallum. One of his sons died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound in his Missoula home in 1974. But I thought, you know, oh, don't jump, I'm not done yet. I'm not done with Spider. So I thought this was a good paragraph to wrap the story of Spider Mccallum. Colorful in life and convoluted in death, Mccallum was as hard as nails and as puzzling as a 10,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. My dad was never around a lot, says Spooner. There are a lot of things about him and his life that I myself am still learning about. So I had found some material about Spider, and I was lucky enough to send it to Anita, and some things that she hadn't seen about her dad. And so it was one of the stories in the book that I most enjoyed being a part of. So this case happened in 1973, and it's about a murderer who comes to dinner. This was unsolved until 2019, until new DNA technology and evidence identified who was the culprit. So these are Clifford and Linda Bernhardt of Billings. So they were supposed to attend a family dinner on the evening of November 6, 1973, but at the last minute they turned down the invitation and stayed home. Their bodies were found there the next day. In 2019, new DNA analysis determined that their killer had been one of Linda's coworkers. And that person, once they identified him, as I was mentioning, he was already deceased. But he still lived in Billings for the rest of his life. So this is another case that was in there too. You know, one of the interesting things is that the man they identified was Cecil Caldwell as the killer. That was his name. So he had worked where Linda had worked for about 10 years until 1976. So he knew her and he knew the husband, which would explain like the lack of forced entry at the crime scene, because there was a third plate that was set at the dinner table that hadn't been touched, and that third plate had stayed there, and it always baffled authorities for years, you know, why the third plate and who the third plate could have been set for, and why it was fixed and why it was never touched. So so the man that they identified, you know, through DNA as the killer, you know, his obituary is online, and this is part of his obituary. He was a father of two with two stepchildren who had no criminal history, and according to his obituary, he was loved by all and will be greatly missed. So, and they probably had no idea what he had done either, his family. So.
Did they ever determine the motive?
You know, it looked like he had a particular fixation and an obsession with her, and that would have, and his motive was probably either, you know, rejection or jealousy. So, and yeah. So we've had our share of homegrown serial killers too. From a lot of people probably remember this man, Wayne Nance, who was an active serial killer in Missoula for a number of years. So he was a particularly sadistic and heinous person. So no one knows precisely how many people Wayne Nance killed, though. Law enforcement in Missoula conclusively assigned him with 4 murders: the murder of Donna Pounds in 1974, and then she was a girlfriend of his. And then he killed another woman who was a late summer fling. And then he also killed a couple in their home in 1985 in Missoula, Mike and Teresa Shook. Do you guys know anything about Wayne Nance, or some of the details of Nance? So he worked at a furniture store, and that furniture store still exists. Anybody know Collins? Yeah, it's not good advertising for Collins, is it? But this is what his MO was, to drop the furniture off, scope out the place, and come back and commit another crime. So they figure that he kept folders and boxes of souvenirs and trinkets in places of people whose trust that he had obtained, and he would go back, later, and he would during a home invasion, and he would tie him up and kill him. So this went on for 12 years. So this is 74 to 1986. So Wayne Nance, his nickname, he was known as the Missoula Mauler. That was his nickname. There's a hockey team with that very same name, the Missoula Maulers, but that was what Wayne Nance was known as. So Missoula kind of lived under a reign of terror because of this monstrous set of rape murders that stumped the police. So this is Nance, a local furniture delivery man, was ultimately revealed as the perpetrator. So here's Nance's driver's license photo from 1985, courtesy Montana Historical Society. So, so he was killed by his in a home invasion. Fortunately, one of the homeowners was armed, so he had come into the house, tied the woman up downstairs, beat the male. The male got loose and killed him during the invasion, or he would have killed, and he would have kept killing. There's always been some speculation that maybe his father could have been involved. Dad lived in East Missoula, but that's never been conclusively proven. So. A killer is killed. Boy, that always feels good to say, doesn't it? So, and there's something over here. We're gonna. I thought I had this in chronological order. Okay, I did, but it skipped one. This one's fascinating. This is one that I've spent a lot of time on. The vanishing of a priest. Do you remember this one? From Father Kerrigan in Ronan, Montana. So this one is kind of, I've spent a lengthy amount of time within the book. So Father Kerrigan, this is 1984. So Father Kerrigan is in Ronan. He's at a bakery. It's 11 o'clock at night. He's going to start a new position at the rectory, and he had just been transferred from Plains. So like June of '84. He's at a bakery at about 11 o'clock. He's greeting people, saying hello, smiling, excited to go meet the new parish and start talking to the new parishioners the next day. And about a week later, his car is found with some blood in it, and then like a bloody pile of clothes are found up the road on Highway 93. So interesting enough, Kerrigan this was his 20th parish in just a few years. He'd been going from parish to parish, and about 2015, the Diocese of Helena released a list of pedophiles, pedophile priests, and whose name is on there but Father Kerrigan. So it's always been speculated, what could have happened to Kerrigan. Maybe it was revenge killing. And maybe it was someone that he had wronged or harmed. But Kerrigan was absolutely and positively a pedophile priest who had been shuttled from parish to parish and place to place. So in June of '84, this is his 20th or 22nd or 23rd parish, and he's supposed to start at the church, and he's never seen again. So I call it the vanishing of a priest, but it's certainly most likely a murder. So this one was really interesting. There was some speculation that it could have been tied to another priest who was murdered, Father Rivera in New Mexico. So Father Rivera was killed right around that same time. They were both killed with a wire hanger. So the speculation, there was a bloody wire hanger found at the crime scene. There was also a wire hanger that was found at Rivera's crime scene too. So it turned out that both of Rivera and Father Kerrigan had attended a treatment center in Jemez Springs, New Mexico, for wayward priests, for priests who had strayed, or priests who had compulsions or addictions or sexual issues, or aberrant sexual proclivities. So they were both there around the same time. So there's always been a speculation. New Mexico police have nixed that idea. There hasn't been much of a new lead or much information about the case in decades. But there was always this possible connection that maybe it was to the New Mexico murder. New Mexico police have said that there's no connection whatsoever. Montana police have not given too much information, but there's always been a possible connection to other mysteries. And there's a lot, this is really interesting, is, I was looking into another murder. There's a lot of death around this time in this area. And there was I'm going to read you just some of the possibilities of names that have surfaced. So, nor could police establish any criminal association between Kerrigan's case and the disappearance of Reverend Anderson in Townsend 2 years earlier. Do you guys remember this case, Reverend Anderson? So Anderson was reported to have been suffering from mental health problems and may have been facing termination from his position in the church. That was according to a 1988 article. So in October of 1992, 10 years after his disappearance, Anderson's Volkswagen was found abandoned in the Big Belt Mountains north of Townsend. His body has never been discovered. So one other case that tantalized investigators due to its proximity and time frame, 2 days after Kerrigan was last seen, a 31-year-old school teacher named Curtis Holman went missing from Missoula. Holman, a math teacher at Target Range Elementary School, was last seen in Missoula on July 22nd, 1984. 12 days later, his Toyota pickup truck was found abandoned on a logging road around Placid Lake. Authorities suspect Holman had taken his own life, and he was later declared dead. But Holman's brother fueled speculation when he told the reporter that the fate of his despondent sibling might have been linked to Father Kerrigan's. So his brother had mentioned that maybe he was involved somehow in a relationship with Kerrigan. So there was a lot of mysteries related to the vanishing of Father Kerrigan, but he was listed as a child sexual predator. And another interesting thing, so I wrote about this for the Flathead Living magazine, and I'll show you a picture, one other picture of the church. So yeah, that's the rectory right there. So after I wrote about it for Flathead Living magazine, the lead detective's daughter sent me a message. So the detective who worked on this case in Montana, his name was Paul Shama. So his daughter Vanessa said, "Hey, I got something that you really want to hear." So after a couple months of playing cat and mouse and missing each other, I got a hold of her and she got a hold of me. And according to Vanessa, and this is her theory, she says that her dad always told her that the crime scene was staged, that there was too much blood in the car, that Father Kerrigan escaped with the help of the diocese. So the problem is that you can't reach Paul Chalmer because he was subsequently murdered in a drive-by shooting in the Cleveland area. So Paul, there's nobody to ask as far as, But she said she was going to produce some of the notes and some information. She never has, but she's adamant that her dad, who was the lead detective on this case, would tell her at family barbecues and sitting around the Christmas tree in the living room about these cases that he worked on when he was in Montana. So, there's another link here. So the detective who worked on Father Kerrigan's case, Shama, he had worked on other cases in California years before. He was involved with putting away some bad guys in the Hells Angels organization. So he went undercover, and Shama went undercover, and his information led to the arrest and conviction of multiple members of the Hells Angels gangs for multiple crimes. So there was a bounty put on his head by some folks in the Hells Angels organization. So Vanessa and her father moved, they went to the Midwest, they assumed a different identity. This is all true. And Paul eventually, his past caught up with him because he was executed while he was working as a running a pizza parlor in the Midwest. But Vanessa, his daughter, contacted me, and she said that her dad had always told her that Kerrigan escaped with the help of the diocese and the crime scene was staged, but I just haven't been able. That's for somebody else to prove or disprove. But lots of theories related to the vanishing of Father Kerrigan. So, all right. You know that guy. So we all stop along the interstate, right, when we get tired, or maybe we don't all, some of us do. Pull over on the side of the road, take a little break, take a little siesta, snooze. I do that, So I have a max now. It used to be 17 hours. That was my maximum time that I could go without hallucinating. Because there have been times, after 17 hours, where I started to see things like gazelles and animals that don't exist, in Montana or in the West. And so I had a 17-hour cap. Now, with the occasional kind of floater coming in the eyes and eye strain, I cap it at about 10. But Dexter Stefanik made the fatal mistake of stopping at a rest stop in Montana, and this is what happened to him. You guys might know this case in Glendive. So this is the case, the unsolved murder. This one's exceptionally creepy, not as if some of them haven't been creepy just yet. But this is a murder at the Bad Route Rest area, and that's the name of it today. Anybody ever stop at the Bad Route Rest area? Yeah, I recommend that maybe you don't. So this is in Glendive. So I'll read you just a little bit about Dexter's case. So in the winter of 1985, Dexter W. Stefanik, 67, embarked on a long trip from his son's farm in the Portland, Oregon area to Stefanik's home in Rhinelander, Wisconsin. It wasn't unusual for him to drive alone for 2,000 miles across 5 sparsely populated states. A few years earlier, he had retired from a Wisconsin paper mill, and only a year before, his wife, Vivian, died. Stefanik was employed by the Rhinelander Paper Company for more than 30 years before retiring to care for Vivian, who was ailing from severe arthritis. As the first anniversary of her death approached, he told his son that he felt a little melancholy and he wanted to go home to their home in the Oneida County town of Pine Lake. Stefanik left his son's house in Oregon on November 18, 1985. He told his son that he planned to sleep at rest stops along the way. He drove a light brown 1984 Plymouth Horizon. He was last seen at the Bad Route rest stop on Interstate 94, approximately 20 miles west of Glendive. So his body was discovered in the dump sometime later, approximately 20 miles west of Glendive. But that's the car above that was incinerated and found at the rest stop area. And the Stefanik murder remains unsolved. Is this okay? I got a couple more. Is you guys okay with just? Is this a good pace? Just okay. All right. So, all right. Well, this one is important to me because this is a girl named Amy Johnson. I've gotten to know Amy's family intimately over the last couple of years, and there was very little information about this. It had just been labeled a missing person. And after several months, if not a few years, of been able to, I can say conclusively, I feel like I know who killed her. I mentioned that in the book. He was the prime suspect. He's no longer alive, but this story has just a little special meaning because it was able to form a connection and contact with her brother Chris in Missoula and her sister Bridget and some other folks. So I was going to read you a little bit about a life and a disappearance. And I think the value and the benefit here is that there were a lot of people who knew Amy and who were still living, and who knew her in 1986 and remember her, and it was just very important for them to see that she had not been forgotten. So I was going to read just a little bit about Amy, a little segue to this article. There is a tendency in crime reporting to get bogged down in a morass of distant language, of callous formulas, or even worse, a quagmire of apathy. Blanket explanations separate the general public from the murder victim, and words are applied, albeit often unconsciously, that make the death just one of another non-relatable incidents. Amy Marie Johnson reportedly ran with a bad crowd and, quote, a rough crowd, and she was labeled as troubled. But that's not much of a foundation or conclusion for any story. While Amy Johnson's life may be observed in frosty statistics, 24-year-old Native female, black hair, brown eyes, last seen in downtown Livingston, disappeared May 16, 1986, told roommates she'd be back in a few hours. This cold data doesn't expand the understanding of the mother who never returned to her baby girl, or a daughter who left behind a grieving family. Perhaps what follows here provides a less impersonal launching spot to re-examine her life. So I think that this one's very, very special because I had the opportunity to do that, to re-examine her life. And so I did that in here. So this is one other story. So Amy has never been found, but so the man that she had been dating at the time, a man named Ron Phillips, he was the last person to see her alive, and he's no longer alive. And I finally got a death certificate. So the Department of Criminal Investigation in Helena says that if Ron Phillips is dead, then the murder of Amy Johnson is in their minds, he's the one that's responsible, so there's no investigation. But he was never charged in his lifetime. He lived up until a couple of years ago and just died of a heart attack in the oil fields in North Dakota. So, and then in the early 90s, you're not going to believe this. This guy walks into the police department in Livingston and says, I know who killed Amy. I know where she's buried. I helped take the body up there. We took it up in a wheelbarrow up this area by Mill Creek. I was afraid of Ron. And I confirm, this is the sheriff of Livingston at the time had told me this story, so I put it in the book, and I have no compunction or regret of using these names. So, because it's all true. So the guy's name, we'll call him JD, walks into the police department, and he tells Sheriff Charlie Johnson, who's the sheriff at the time, says, Ron intimidated me. I was afraid of him. He lured her out he got her out of the porch, got her out of the house. He killed her, took the body up Mill Creek, stabbed her in the chest. And JD's like testimony to Charlie Johnson. I mean, it's graphic. He said that Ron told him, he remembered the sound of her gurgling on the knife. And so anyhow, they take the body, allegedly, according to this man, and they take it up Mill Creek and they bury it. So Charlie Johnson goes up there. This is in the early 90s. This is about 6-7 years after she'd gone missing. They do a hunt. They take the cadaver dogs out. They find physical evidence that actually corresponds to what JD's saying. In the wheelbarrow is up there, but they never charged him, and they were never able to charge Ron Phillips either. I think that Phillips worked. He's a bad person. He's had a bad life, and he comes from a bad family. They've all been involved in heavy drug trafficking and narcotics. Ron has an arrest rap sheet that's longer than my arm. He's not alive anymore, but I think that he had gone undercover and he made a plea, or he made a bargain, that they wouldn't charge him for this if he turned on maybe some other crimes. I think that's what happened. So we've been, for years, have been trying to get the DCI to give the death certificate of Amy Johnson to the family, because in their minds, the DCI says Ron Phillips did it, case closed. Well, I got the death record about a month ago, and it wasn't, it was a hard moment for Amy's siblings, because they'd always thought that maybe Ron had been alive and they were harboring him, or something else was going on. Anyhow, the guy who allegedly buried the body, I've been working for a little while with a friend of mine who's a private investigator in Kansas doing interviews on other cases. So I've had access to certain databases that private investigators use. Well, the man that I was told that by Sheriff Charlie Johnson helped bury Amy Johnson's body, he lives in Alba, Texas with his mother. So I dropped a letter in the mail to him, And I said, hey, maybe it's, I'm a friend of the family. Maybe I'd like to know what you told Sheriff Charlie Johnson. I don't get a response. So I say, the guy has a couple kids, and they still live in Livingston, and he's got an ex-girlfriend. So I write the ex-girlfriend a letter, and I said, here's what I know. Here's what he told Sheriff Charlie Johnson. I want him to repeat it, and here's what your son should know. So I get this letter. I get this phone call. These two kids screaming, MFer, who are you, and this and that. And I said, listen, son, I didn't say this stuff to this police officer. Your dad did. You know where he is, and I would love to speak with him. And then the tone changes, right? And he hangs up, and then they never call me again. They must have deleted and blocked me for some crazy reason. So, so there are a couple cases that are really personal. A lot of the stuff, it's not personal because I have no actual connection to it. I haven't been inserted in it. And it's like, reading copy off of a page. It's horrific, and I'm sympathetic, and it's disturbing. But to see some of this stuff firsthand and get to know the families, this is more of a connected case, and this is very special for me. So I hope you enjoy reading about Amy. Yeah. Just a couple more, if you guys are okay. Do you guys know these faces? Yeah, I put this one in here too, which is the death of Patrick Duffy's parents, who were the shotgun slangs of a TV star's parents in Boulder, Montana. That's Terrence and Babe Duffy, and there's their son Patrick. So I spent a little time writing about that one as well. So Montana has a successful tourism industry, right? I mean, it's burgeoning. I see stats that say, visitation is probably just as high as it was ever. If not, it's surpassing all kinds of numbers and records, right? In like Yellowstone and Glacier and other places. And most people come and go, right? They come, they have a good time, they pick up a couple trinkets, some souvenirs, maybe some salt and pepper shakers that have Montana on it. But some folks never get out of the state. They come to visit, and they're murdered. And this is a couple, and this is an unsolved case. This is a double homicide of tourists. Do you guys remember this one? And this is in Sealy Lake. They were found in 1991. This is Kenneth and Iva LaRue Cheatham. Kenneth and Iva Cheatham. So they left their home in Washington in late July 1991 to visit Glacier National Park, which is a place that they loved. Their intended route would take them through the beautiful Swan Valley for the first time, and the couple never made it to Glacier. And so their van was found on a newly cut logging road west of Lake Alva, and then a month later their bodies were found about 2 miles away. They had each been shot, and there's never been an apprehension in this case either. There's the first new piece of information. So this happened again in 1991. About 2 years ago, like Missoula County Sheriff's Department gave some new information. It was about a camcorder strap. Did you remember that? There was a strap. They released some information of they were looking for a camcorder that had been stolen out of their van, and they released I think they gave the serial number. I mean, who knows if people even use camcorders anymore? But they found the strap, and they released that as information as a possible link or lead to what happened to these folks. So, but other than that, there's been very little information about the case. Yeah. So if you guys, next time you're at a garage sale and you see a Hitachi, they have the number and the name and the serial information. So, especially if you're in the Sealy Lake area and you see a camcorder, I'd call the police immediately. One of the things that's interesting is that Sealy Lake is actually in Missoula County, right? Yeah, some reason that doesn't compute. It's like Lincoln being in Lewis and Clark County. There's just sometimes where, I don't know, it just surprises me, even though I know it. So, anyhow, this is an interesting case too. Do you remember? This one actually involves a psychic. Do you guys remember? This one is really fascinating. Not only they all haven't been fascinating, but this is they were killed by a guy named. Well, I won't get that far. They were killed for no reason. So this is up in 1993 in Ferndale. So does anybody know where Ferndale is? No, from Montana. Yeah. Yeah. I didn't know. Yeah, I didn't know that. Yeah, I didn't know that until this book. There's a lot of little towns that I've never even heard of. So on August 12th, 1993, John and Nancy Bosco, they were murdered in their home in Ferndale, a rural community near Big Fork. So, which I learned. So they had been shot to death while they slept in what authorities characterize as an execution-style killing. So it turns out they had just, someone broke into the residence and had killed both of them. And it didn't seem like there was any forced entry. It didn't seem like there was any signs of a perpetrator, taking anything or stealing anything. So no signs that there was a robbery. So they had some laboratory work and sent off the DNA and the forensics, and nothing came back. And then the case went silent. And then they started looking into maybe their past to see if they had problems that might have contributed to their death. So they had only moved to Montana recently. So they thought, well, maybe he was involved in something in Colorado. So they went down that route and that angle, sort of doing a social autopsy on John, and they didn't find anything. So they come up empty again. So they they just moved to the Flathead Valley from Boulder the previous spring. So the case it goes dormant. So about 2 weeks after the murder, she first contacts a psychic. So John's mother, Antoinette, she is from the East Coast, and I think she was a journalist for a long time. She contacts a psychic. So the guy's name is Danian Brinkley. So he claimed that he had psychic abilities, and he was a medium. He lived in South Carolina. He got hit by lightning a couple times, and after he got, a couple times, right? Isn't that amazing? So, and I guess after the second time, he started to do something called like remote viewing. You ever hear about this? It's like when you sit in a room and you see things that happen like across the globe. The government was using him for a while to identify maybe where hostages were being held and abduction cases. So Mom hears about this guy, and she's skeptical too. I mean, the skeptical antenna goes up whenever you hear somebody got hit by lightning twice, right? So she decides that he'd been Dannon is his name too. So Dannon had been pronounced clinically dead 2 times as well. So, but he had predicted, witness like 117 record future events over the course of his life. So she says, well, why not? I'll give it a shot. So John's mom, goes to Brinkley, and he's out in South Carolina. She flies him in, says, come over to the property. Let me just see what get a sense of your suspicions or anything that raises your skeptical antenna, anything that troubles you, anything that bothers you. Just throw it out there. Do a little stream of consciousness, little visit and tour of the site. See, and he comes out. And he immediately begins to describe a suspect. So the killer, he said, was, quote, a young male companion of the Boscos who knew the layout of their home. He said that the suspect was a student at a Western college. It's very specific. And the suspect would be arrested in or around December of 1993. So the police take that information, and they find out, they go to this man over here, because Dannon had said, yeah, it's someone that knows him, someone who was intimate, who knew the layout of the home, someone who has some type of connection to these folks, and he's out of college and gives all these details. So this is Joseph Shadow Clark. So he was 18. He's not 18 in this photo, but he was 18 at the time. A 1993 graduate of Big Fork High School was arrested for the Bosco murders. So Clark knew the Boscos and had formerly lived in the murder house. He said that he'd been having nightmares about killing them, and one night simply woke up and did it. And this guy's still in prison. He's not like the other one, all the old ones. Everybody seems to get out after a couple of weeks, right? A couple of months. So fortunately, this guy's still sitting like Buddha in a 10-foot cell. So he, the interesting thing about this case too is that his name is Shadow, and that's what he acted like. He came into the house like a shadow, and he killed these two people, Joseph Shadow Clark. And while the prosecution was talking to the defense about how much time he should get and what the sentence should be, they said, give us something, give us like a motive. I mean, did he take something? Was he obsessed with her? I mean, like, well, what triggered this, you know? Have him, you know, let's, maybe we could find out something from like a psychological profile that could prevent certain acts like this, but we can gather a psychological profile of him. Maybe it'll help us, you know, deter other crimes and criminals. And the guy said over and over again, I simply don't know. I don't know. He said he didn't know. He couldn't give a reason. He couldn't give one. He said he just woke up and did it. So he's at Montana State Prison. He'll be eligible for parole when he's about 60 years old, which should be coming up soon. So no motive was ever determined for the crime. Interesting enough was Antoinette Bosco, John's mother, who contacted the medium, and the medium helped, you know, solve the crime. Despite the horror of losing, you know, one of her sons to a senseless homicide, Antoinette Bosco said she never considered the death penalty for the murderer and was a staunch anti-death penalty advocate for a number of years. And I think she just died recently. So, okay, a couple more faces, you know. And I'm going to get to one in Helena too, and then, okay? And then, all right, here's another face you don't want to see on